I am joined today by Margot Andersen. Welcome.
Thanks, Emma. It's great to be joining you today.
Thank you. So, you have built your career in the sort of leadership, organisational development space, and in recent times been working a lot supporting expats.
Yeah.
And before we get on to all of that, which I'm absolutely fascinated to talk to you about, in terms of your own career, where did that start? How did you sort of start on the path to that
Yeah.
space?
Wind the clock back, right? The memory
Yeah,
clock. Yeah. Look, like many people, where I started and where I am today is quite different. So I
yeah.
commenced my career as a teacher. I very nearly pursued a path in journalism, but I'd always had this desire to be a teacher. So I actually changed course and went back to that desire pretty quickly. And so I trained as a primary school teacher. I was Queensland trained. So for me, that meant when I graduated that I went onto a rotation system or a placement system. So Queensland's a very big state, so you can be transferred anywhere. And I commenced my career in a small regional town with a population of about 500. So that was really
Wow.
interesting and
Yeah.
had a couple of year levels. And I had 3 moves with Queensland Ed. I did 3 lots of 2 years, where that took me to a couple of different places, ending up in a place called Toowoomba, which is just west of Brisbane. And I loved my career as a teacher. I didn't think I'd ever change, which is always really interesting. But what happened is I got to a point where I was like, there was an opportunity to go overseas. And as a teacher, I was really fortunate because I could travel and pretty much use my qualification in many parts of the world. So I
Mm.
went to London thinking I would go for 9 months. And like
That's
many
a familiar
expats,
story, yes.
yeah, found myself there still many, many years later, and I'd changed careers. So I had my first year in London, I did the supply teaching thing, which was pretty brutal, if I'm going to be honest.
Mm.
But I was there, my motivation for being there was to travel. And so I had a year of doing lots of travel, supplementing that with some teaching, and then I decided to go back for a second year. And that's when I thought I really need to make a call as to whether or not I'm going to go, pursue teaching here, or I'm going to use it as an opportunity to look at something different. And I thought I'd only be there another year. I was there on a working holiday visa. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to just try something different. And I happened to have that conversation with my recruiter, and they said, would you come and work for us? So basically,
Ah.
I ended up in the world of education recruitment and resourcing, which was really interesting because in the UK, people from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa all had reciprocal rights at the time to come. So
Mm.
there's really big recruitment drive. So I saw that sort of global recruitment piece happening there. And then decided, okay, I really don't want to stay. Sorry, really don't want to leave. I want to stay,
Mm.
but was really sort of restricted by this visa issue. And I met with a company who said, well, we're actually buying education firms, and we also have recruitment. We also have, other parts of resourcing and strategy and projects. Come and work for us. And I really didn't quite know what I was saying yes to. I just knew that I wanted to be in the UK. So I said yes. And I mean, I think they were like, do you want a visa? I was like, yes. They were like, will you work
Yes,
hard?
please.
Yes. And so then we just worked it out from there. But I very much fell into the world of operations. And so they were acquiring and integrating companies. And I took over a division that was, I would say, at best broken.
Mm.
And so it was a matter of really looking at it, pulling it apart, putting together a strategy, building a team, and then really just going and executing the plan. And so it was sales operations. So it was a really good role for me in terms of learning the commercials
Mm.
and having some good people leadership exposure. And part of being in a big company is you get great exposure to lots of training and development, etc. But what was really lovely is that I was still using my knowledge of education and teaching. So I could relate to clients, I could relate to regional operating models, or regional operations of education head offices, etc. So there was a link there that carried me through.
Mm.
Had a wonderful time, worked incredibly hard, worked hard, play hard, that certain phase of your career and life.
And
And
London's a good place to do
and
that
London's a
phase
good
of your
place to do
career
that.
and life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, and it's still, fed my love of travel. And I mean, it was just the most extraordinary experience. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. But I got to a juncture where, looking back, I would say I was burnt out. I wouldn't have said that at the time, but I just knew and recognized that I needed a break. And I thought, I actually think I want my life in Australia. I was being offered a regional role at the time, and I was like, oh my gosh, for this to work for me and for the organisation, I probably need to give it another 3 or 4 years here. And so I got to a point where I thought, right role, wrong place, wrong country. And so it was my decision to leave. It was my decision around when I left and the timing of that. It was really important for me to go out on a high when I felt things had been put back together and we'd had some really great wins. I knew that I was ready for the next step or the next role in my career. But as I said, I just felt that I needed to make a call on where that was going to happen. So I returned to Australia and I came to Melbourne, which is not where I'm from. So in some ways I kind of thought, oh, look, the adventure continues a little bit. I'm coming to somewhere new. But that's where I think I would say that I really had that first real critical juncture in my career. It was incredibly difficult. And part of that was very underestimated by me. So I hadn't really done the thinking and the work around what it might take to do that. I think I was very much like, I'm coming back to Australia. I've lived there before.
Yeah.
How hard can it be? I'll get this stuff sorted. I transitioned from one career to another or one industry to another. How hard can it be? And landed back here and just went, oh my gosh, this is going to be so much harder than I thought. And in a sense, I felt like I had to start my career again, which was very confronting. I had given a window of return to the UK. So they said to me, look, I was just, not so much the regional role will remain open, but we'd love to keep talking to you if you decide to come back. Why don't you take a sabbatical? And I was like, way too young for a sabbatical. That doesn't make any sense at all.
They were trying all the tricks though, weren't they?
Yeah.
They obviously wanted to keep you.
And, I think, like many people for that first year or so at home, your networks are stronger where you are. It feels like it would be easier to go back to. It was hard being home. It wasn't anywhere near the level or the exposure and diversity and complexity that I'd been used to. But deep inside, I knew I wanted to be in Australia. So I felt like, right, roll up your sleeves and get cracking and start to look at this again. So I joined a firm that was recruitment and HR consulting. So it's still in that space of talent and talent management and resourcing. And so started with that. And I was fortunate I was working for somebody who had been an expat before. So he was a little bit like, I got no idea what to do with you, but, I like your background, come and join. Which was really interesting after, really having a lot of difficult conversations about where do you fit, and somebody sort of went, you've got an interesting background now, I like it, So
I think that shared experience piece becomes so critical, because it's exactly what you say, someone that just kind of looks at you and gets it and kind of thinks, well, I don't necessarily know where to put you, but I know I want you somewhere.
And there's a sense of, they can join the dots. I'm not hustling for my worth, the whole time. Although when I started, I was, I really did go back to base on many levels. But that was okay because I was aligned with my inner sense of being where I wanted to be. So that was really good. And then since then, I've been back some time now. So I actually worked for him in another sort of iteration of my career where when he'd sold the business, we had some time looking at sort of, new business opportunities and stripping them back. And then I sort of went into the world of probably more traditional HR consulting. And then I sort of worked out that I'm not really HR. I'm really that bridge between HR and operations. And I'm probably more operations, but, with good people and good mix and building teams. And so today I have two businesses, one being TalentInsight, which is that workforce strategy piece, and the leadership development. So I put my teaching hat back on in many occasions and run training, lots of training programs and executive coaching, working with leaders who are really going through change. and needing to bring their people with them. And I have a business called InSync, which is really, again, another nice thread to my background. And that is I work with Australian expats who are navigating the return to Australia and looking to rebuild their professional network here, or looking to put together a real strategy around their career management of moving careers and bringing that home. And I would say that that was an accidental business. It started as a network group because I simply just kept meeting people and I didn't have time to have that many coffees, if I'm really honest.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, look, let's start a network. And being Melbourne based, lockdowns were pretty cruel to us. So we had 2 years
Yeah.
where we couldn't run events. And so I, like you, started a podcast, and that put us on the radar overseas. And that's where the drive for the career development piece came, or the career strategy piece really came from. So I'm very proud of that business, and I'm very probably emotionally invested in it. But also
Yeah.
I just think it makes sense that you've got to surround yourself with like-minded people, and you've got to get the tools and the resources and the tips, to navigate a
Yeah.
transition like that. So, if I
Yeah.
think about my career, it's really been around personally navigating transition and change. And I think the work that I do is around supporting others navigate that transition and change journey as well.
Yeah. And also, as you said, I was thinking about it when you were talking about starting as a teacher, that educational thread that
Yeah.
just kind of goes all the way through, which is, it's also really lovely. It's one of the
Yeah.
things I really love about these conversations, that sometimes, it's often the way actually, that things aren't clear in forward motion. They're often only
Yeah.
clear in hindsight, when you
Yeah.
can actually kind of join the dots and see, actually, all of this is
Yeah.
very interrelated. It's
Yeah.
it's
And
actually
they're
fascinating.
foundational, aren't they? Often,
Yeah, yeah,
So you
absolutely.
mightn't
Yeah.
hold the title like you used to in that domain,
Mm,
but you bring the knowledge and the skills and things with you.
yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah. And I'd imagine, having been through your own expat experience, and having found that quite confronting in terms of, how do I actually do this? Again, to my earlier point of shared experience, you kind of understand what people are going through there.
Yeah.
Why why do you think it's so hard? Appreciate that's a very simple question for what
Yeah.
is a complex thing, but why do you think it is that way?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think, when you're an expat, you don't just move a career, you don't just change jobs. You move lives and careers at the same time. And so we change. We personally change and evolve a
Yeah.
lot, as well as our skill set and our, roles and things that we do. So there's a bit of a dual change process that goes on there. And for many of us who've been expats, we've kind of landed in a market that's bigger and more dynamic and more complex, and it's fast paced and it's moving really quickly and evolving and changing really quickly. And so I think you feel like you kind of get swept up in this wave of motion and forward momentum. And when you come back to Australia, it's a significantly smaller market. And
Yeah.
so it doesn't feel like there's that wave of momentum behind you. And if you've been gone for a significant period of time, your networks, whilst they're still really valuable to you, they've done different things as well. And so
Yeah.
we're out of step with each other in terms, and so we need to kind of reestablish that relationship. We need to reestablish our knowledge and our networks, our understanding of the local market. One of the things that I get really frustrated with is when expats are told, oh, where's your Australian experience? Oh, you've been out of the market. Well, actually, they haven't been out
Tell
of the
me
market
about it.
often. They've just
Yeah.
been out of the local market, right? That
Yeah.
doesn't mean it's irrelevant, but I think it's really around I'm not visible here. So how do I build visibility
Yeah.
and relevance? And so that takes time. And, one of the things that I would say about managing transition and managing significant change is many of us underestimate the time, the energy, the financial wherewithal sometimes that's involved with that. And that's even when it's good, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think about when I went to London, as much as I loved it, that first year, you were just trying to work out the city. You're trying to work out how it worked and, how everything worked socially as well as professionally. And it was great. but it takes time and it took energy. And I think one of the reasons I stayed on for my second year is it's like, I've just done all the hard work. I want to stay here
Yeah.
and reap some of the rewards, right? And it's
Yeah.
no different when you come back. So there's that whole piece around, okay, I've got to work out how to get back in step, with the market and with the opportunities. And I also think with what I want to do. So depending on when you return, and because I work now with so many expats, I work with people who went when they were 20 and accidentally stayed and they're coming home at 32. But their
Yes,
career's been,
completely different.
yeah, very different if have been away and you're coming back and you're 52, because you're at a
Yeah.
different age and stage of life. And so you've got to work out, well, what is it that I want from my career, or what role do I want work to play in my life? Because for some of us, we return and go, I'm in a really expensive phase of life. I need a full-time job. I need to work. I want to pursue and grow my career in this lane in Australia. For others, they're coming back and they're saying, well, actually, I understand that the work I've been doing overseas may not exist for me in abundance, or may not
Yeah.
exist for me. So I want to do something different. And so then there's that piece around, well, we need to get really clear about what does that something different look like or
Yeah.
mean. So it's that career definition that sort of really has to take place. And, there's so many overlaying factors that go with that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I wonder as well if, because it is, such a big move home, that often the logistics of the move kind of take priority over the career, and that's the bit that people focus on. So often they arrive and then spend perhaps another month, 6 weeks, two
Yeah.
months finding somewhere to live and doing all of that, obviously very
Yeah.
important stuff. And then at the end of that, kind of go, right, I'm ready to look for a job now. And then
Absolutely.
there's a bit of a shock of like,
The
this
lag.
isn't going to be as easy as I think it's going to be. I've seen that
Yes.
happen quite a few times.
You're so right, Emma. I think, typically if I think about how and when people engage with our network, they're often engaging either 12 months out because they know they either want to come home with a role or to a role, or they want to come home with confidence in the market. So they're aware that they need to do some work and they can do that before they get home. And others are like, I'm in such a big job. I have no bandwidth to be
Yes.
thinking
Yeah.
about some of that. I've just got to get home. I've got to have 6 months to work it out or 3 months to work it out, and then I'll get going. But as I say to people all the time, it's one thing for you to get clear about what you want. It's another thing to know what the market will let you do.
Yes.
And you have to be really cognizant that you have to understand not just what you want, but what is it that's going on in the market at the moment in relation to
Yeah.
that, clarity or desire that you have. And that takes time. So we then often pick up people at that 3-month mark post return, or 6-month mark post return, because they've sorted the logistics. They've got their
Yeah.
selves home, they've got the pets home, they've got the kids home and into school, and they bought the house and moved and got their pensions and
Yeah.
all their money out, or whatever it is that they needed to do. And they're like, okay, I've had a good mental break, I'm ready to go. But the market's not ready for them.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to get back in step with that. So I think it's that managing expectations. And
Yeah.
because it is a life transition as well as a career transition, when you take a few knocks, or you get quite a few rejections, or thanks but no thanks, it can knock your confidence.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I think, to your point earlier, surrounding yourself with like-minded people then, or people with a common and shared experience, is really important, because they will invariably understand and relate, because it feels very personal otherwise. It feels like it's being done
Yeah.
to you.
I think there's two really critical points there. I love your turn of phrase on the market isn't ready for you. I think you said it as,
Yeah.
and that I think is kind of a real sort of light bulb moment. And secondly, the confidence piece I think is huge. But also it's interesting on that kind of the market being ready for you, because, and similarly to your own experience, that often when the person's overseas, they're on this huge growth trajectory. They're taking on new opportunity. It seems like you said, you're riding the wave. There's all this opportunity, there's all this stuff happening, and so they often feel on this real sort of upward trajectory, and then come back. And I think that's where some of that disconnect comes, and then that leads to the loss of confidence. And I think if you're not expecting that as well, you haven't kind of mentally prepared for that, I think that can be really challenging for people.
Incredibly difficult. And I think that we're used to saying yes and holding on and working things out and being problem solvers and saying, I'm not frightened to work hard, I'm not frightened to give this a go, or to get in there and make it happen and to make sure that we're delivering. So you actually almost have this unchanneled energy when you're ready to go. And that is you've really got to manage that carefully, because if it's not being channeled, we get frustrated, we get, worn down or worn out. And that comes out in our conversations when we're networking. It comes out in our interview processes. It comes out in those discussions. And so managing the emotions of change and transition is incredibly important and recognizing where you're at with that so that you can manage that is really important.
Yeah. One of the other things that I've struggled to understand, and to be fair, still struggle to understand, is, to your earlier point, often those roles, if you've been in, say, London or in New York or even Singapore, Hong Kong, the global exposure and the size and scope of what someone's been doing is, you can't really replicate that here. It's just a kind of a reality of the numbers aren't here.
Yeah.
And the thing that always surprises me is that when that person comes back with that type of experience, that I almost feel like people should be, falling over themselves to actually maximize that experience and go, well, hang on, this person's done something that other people, or the majority of other people in the market, haven't experienced. Like, how can we actually make the most of that and kind of access something that we haven't actually got internally at the moment? And that certainly across the board doesn't seem to happen. And I don't really understand why. Like, maybe I'm a bit naive in that thinking. I don't know, but it certainly seems to be the case, or certainly I've heard a lot of experiences where that's happened.
And I think by default, because we are a small market, it's a highly competitive market.
Yes.
And so there's this sense that we're competing against each other all the time. And so with that then comes sometimes, people will say to me, I think they're worried I'm going to take their job. And it's like, well, I think when you're transitioning too, you've got to make it really clear around your motivations for what you're interested in, and not just what you bring to the table, because otherwise people will make assumptions. They'll think, the role's not big enough for you. You'll be bored here. Love your experience. It's amazing, but we can't use it. We don't know how to use it, And so they can't join the dots. So part of our challenge, and I think responsibility for us in managing our careers, is to learn that positioning piece that really demonstrates the relevance in a manner that's, not threatening or seen to cultivate opportunity, rather than just be something like, that's nice to know, but I can't do anything with it, and that takes a bit of time, especially when you're trying to position yourself to a market that the local market that you may not have had a lot of exposure to. So you've got to educate yourself on the market and what the challenges are there to link them. So but I think there's cultural
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there's also some cultural elements there too. There's a good old tall poppy syndrome that we seem to have in Australia, and that is we like people to be just like us, Don't get too far ahead of yourself. And so when you get back, the last thing you fear, or the last thing you want to do, is be positioned or to be labelled, as one of those tall poppies. And so it's just about how do you cultivate and link that experience together in a manner that's, I guess, attractive and relevant. And the positioning, the positioning is key.
It is so key. And I see it all the time as well in the space that I'm in. I think there's almost that assumption, because it's obvious to you, that you don't sort of join the dots for the other person. And that's where the misinterpretation and the misunderstanding can come, that actually you do need to be a little bit prescriptive and say, this is why I'm coming back, and this is the value I bring. And I think the other thing that I sometimes see people do is they can sort of miss the context and not provide the context for the other person. So, if I've been working in London and I don't know, I know Boots the Chemist is a massive brand in London. I write Boots on my CV and I
Yeah.
assume everyone knows what that is. And,
Yeah.
and
That's
it's
a
not the
really,
case,
yeah. Yeah, a really good point, because I will often say to people, you have to not just position yourself, but often you'll have to position the brand that you've been
Yeah,
working for, because if it's unknown, to find a
yeah,
local brand that actually represents that, or represents the challenges that you've been solving. So I'll often talk to people and say, don't talk to me about your title, talk to me
yeah.
about the challenges that you had to solve, because that's what's transferable. That's what's relatable. If
Yeah.
I've been working for a market leader who's had a new competitor come into the market, it's been about holding ground, holding our positioning. It's been about looking at, extracting more value from certain product lines or channels or whatever. That's all relatable. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what the brand is.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
thinking about how you tell your story is really important there.
Yeah. And I also think it comes back to your point about how competitive the market is. And I think if you're a job seeker, you don't necessarily see it from the other side. You only see it from your own perspective. So you think, oh, well, if they don't know the brand, they'll Google it or, they'll figure it out kind of thing.
Yeah.
But if there's 300 people also applying for that same role,
Job.
they won't. They'll just go to the next person if they don't
That's right.
understand it. You
That's
need to
right.
kind of provide that context. And as you said, positioning it is really kind of critical.
Yeah, and language is so important. And probably as an ex-teacher, I come back to, some of those fundamentals around how you're communicating things. But, we all fall into acronyms. We all fall into, sayings and phrases that are just kind of understood in the culture that we're in. They may not be here, but one of the challenges we have is when we come back here and we've been away for a while, is our thinking and our default has actually slightly moved. And so we have to really think about the words and the phrases and the stories that we choose to tell.
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm so passionate about this subject, I mean, certainly in terms of, as a person from the UK, as an immigrant coming here, I've had my own experiences, and as a recruiter worked with a lot of people going
Yeah.
through the same thing. But as I've mentioned to you before, my husband, who I met in London, was originally from Melbourne and had his own kind of expat experience coming
Yeah.
back to Melbourne after 10, 11 years away. I think it was for him. We sort of met right towards the end of that time. But he found it so hard and was just not prepared for that at all. I think he thought
And
it
that
would be pretty easy, and he still thought he had a good network here, still had friends here, still knew people, had a career in Melbourne before he'd gone.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because I think to some degree I did the same, even though I didn't step back into a network here in Melbourne. I just didn't think it would be so hard,
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so, I was like, oh my gosh, have I been ignorant? Have I been, caught on the hop? Am I being a bit assumptive and lazy? Like I was really questioning myself, which is what
yeah,
happens as you then,
absolutely.
really go round and round internally around some of that. So I think the other thing I would say is that when we've grown when we've been away, but so have our networks here. And
Yeah,
so what we tend to do is to remember each other for where we last were when we were together.
yeah, yeah,
So there's that challenge around going, well, I need to get curious around what you've been doing and how that's unfolded. And I need to educate maybe you or share with you a little bit around what I've been doing, so that you can bring each other up to speed. Because if you don't do that, you just keep defaulting back to the role and the level or the company or the whatever that you were last at together, or
yeah,
when you were at uni together, or
yeah,
whatever it might
yeah,
be.
yeah,
So yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So it's challenging. It's very challenging.
Yeah, it is,
So
and to that sort of, yeah, not being prepared for it, and certainly not being appreciative of the amount of time that it would take, and the hit to confidence during that time as well. And
Mm.
one of the things that I sort of obviously heard through him and have seen in my previous recruitment life as well is that I just think recruiters have such a much more of a responsibility than they probably appreciate, just around how they talk to people and how they deal with some of that stuff. I mean, he had someone tell him that he was unemployable in Australia. And like, he's a chartered
It's true.
accountant. Like, it was just the it's like, I'm pretty sure he's not unemployable. But just the fact that someone would say that, it was
Yeah.
just, you know,
Yeah.
there's a bit of a humanity missing there, I
That's
think, you
right.
know? Yeah.
And I think, it's such a highly transactional
Yes.
model, generally
Yeah.
speaking,
Yeah.
that if we just default to the product line or the line
Yeah.
of what we've got, we're taking the human element out of it, isn't it? And at
Yeah.
the end of the day, I think I know that when I was involved in recruitment, and my old boss, he said to me, he said, I think it would be really good for recruiters to be out of work every 3 years and to remember
Yeah.
what it's like to
To
have to
know
put
what
on a
it's
suit or
like.
put on a
Yeah.
work outfit and come into the city
Yeah.
and have to talk about what you've done, because it would bring that humanity back
Yeah.
around that. The
Yeah.
other thing I would say though is that recruiters are not career coaches. And
Yes.
so you've got to be really careful about, what are you looking for when you go to a recruiter. And I think like any, body that you engage, whether it's a builder for a house or something, you've got to have your brief right.
Yeah.
So when you go to a recruiter, you've got to have your brief right, because then it makes it
Yeah.
easy for them to give input or give feedback and advice around that. So, I think that's very important as well, to think about how you
Yeah.
engage with recruiters. So,
I think it's really true, and it's a big motivation for why I've left recruitment and why I'm
yeah.
doing what I'm doing now. That I think people in that position do sort of naturally turn to the recruitment industry thinking that it's
Mm,
there to help them.
mm,
And that's not actually what
no,
it's designed for. Sure, there
no.
are, great recruiters out there who will take the
There
time
are.
to try and help you as much as they can, but it's
Mm,
not actually what the industry is designed for. You're not actually the primary client.
right.
The person paying
Mm.
the bill, the
Is
client is the company is the primary client.
And they are operating in a smaller, more competitive market too.
Yeah.
So if you think about your engagement with a recruiter, maybe in a London or a New York or wherever it was that
Yeah.
you're returning from, they're in a big market, right? They're in a
Yeah.
market that's more complex, has all of those things. So when you come back to Australia, there's a brief. Okay. Now, part of the challenge, I think, as any recruiter would face, is that, sometimes, to put forward a wild card is a great thing in the mix, but you've got to understand, if you're the wild card, you've got to understand that you've got to position yourself in an
Yeah.
interview accordingly. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Mm,
Yeah.
mm.
What do you think is a reasonable kind of lag time? Like, what do you think if I'm, sitting in London as an expat thinking, yeah, I want to come back to Australia?
Yeah.
How soon? Because it is a fine line. You almost can't
Mm,
start too early because then I
mm.
think there's a momentum sort of issue. But
Yeah.
when should people sort of really start doing the
Well,
activity, as it were?
yeah, and look, there's so many variables in that. I
Yeah.
think, it's around what industry are you in, what's your background, where are you returning to? If you're returning to Darwin versus Melbourne, like
Yeah.
they're two different places. I think, but if I think about the average people that I work with or start to take, queries, or when they start to follow along more intently,
Yeah.
maybe with some of the things that we're putting out, they're 1 to 2 years out. And we ran
Wow.
a
That's
yeah.
more than I would assume. Yeah.
So we ran a global survey. We've done it twice now. And what we've seen is a real shift in the length of time that people are taking to prepare. Now, there's couple of things that might come into play there. Either people are hearing more about the challenges,
Yeah.
or they are hearing more about us and the work that we do. So the people that we're surveying, also are tuning in and dialing into this. But 1 to 2 years, if you're a senior professional in your sphere, I would say that in earnest, it's a year out. Like as in applying for roles, as if you're returning with a role. Then there are those that come back and say, Margot, I legitimately do need some time out. And I'm
Yeah.
like, that's okay. But just remember that when you're ready, the market may not be ready. So you might need
Yeah.
to give yourself a year, from when you decide that when you're ready. So in your planning, make sure that you've got the financial reserves for that. And the other thing I would say is emotion, it's not just a financial transition or a career transition, it's an emotional transition. So when you're going for roles and you're not being successful, how are you recalibrating from that? Like, what's your
Yeah.
bounce back factor? What do you need? What support structures do you need around you to help you navigate that time of transition? Because you can't get online and sit down at 8 o'clock in the morning and think, I'm going to get
Yeah.
on Seek and LinkedIn and look at this today, and
Yeah.
then spend all day there. You'll go barking mad,
Yeah,
you
you will.
know. So what are the emotional sides of transition that you need to consider and factor in as well? So, sorry, it's a long way to come back to
No, no.
your question, but I would say that if you're wanting to return with a role and you're a senior professional, you want to give yourself 1 to 2 years.
Yeah.
If you're coming back without a role and thinking I'll have a holiday, or many expats come at Christmas, back at
Yeah.
Christmas, I'll
It's
lie on
what
the
we
beach for
did. Yeah.
January. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I'll be ready by March. The market will have picked up. It'll be a bit more
Yeah.
buoyant. And then all of a sudden in August, you're still talking to people, just know that that's normal. That's not
Yeah.
necessarily out of step. It's not you personally. It's just part of this transition process that you need to be prepared to navigate.
Yeah.
So the other thing I would say is that we know that people often come home, or invariably come home, not for career. They come home for other factors. They come home because mum or dad are aging. We know that they are kids that are entering a certain phase of school. A partner doesn't want to be away, or it's just simply, I just need time out, or I just, it's a lifestyle play.
Yeah.
So if that's why you're coming back, you've got to remain anchored to that.
Yeah.
So that's got to be your driver, because if it's 6 months down the track and you still haven't landed the level of role that you want, and you're not anchored to that, you'll start to be thinking, it's when a lot of people start to go, I think I'll have to go back overseas. I think I'm going to head back. And then the challenge there is actually they head back and it takes a while to adjust to wherever they're going. So, like there's all those layered complications that then come from
Yeah.
that as well.
I think that having that expectation, or that level of understanding that it is going to take time, and certainly not instantaneous, and it could take up to 12 months. I think that is such an important piece of information to have, as you said, to realize that it's not you. This is the experience of most people who are coming back. They are finding the same thing. Like, you are not uniquely cursed that you can't find a
that's
job.
right.
Like, it's complex. Like, there's a lot of moving factors. And I think, thinking back to my husband's situation, I think if he had known that and had that sort of as a time horizon, I think it would have been very different. Certainly in terms of the pressure, I think, that he felt of
On
time
himself,
going by. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I should be in a role, I should be in a role, I should be in a role, as opposed to it is going to, and sure, you've got to work at it, there's things you need to do, all of those things, but just kind of understanding and having that sort of, it is going to take time, I think would have made a really big difference to him.
Yeah, it's and I think find people who've navigated the transition that
Yeah.
you've done before, or
Yeah.
because or those who are going through it,
Yeah.
But I think the beauty of what I've seen with the InSync network is that it's not just people who are mid-transition, it's people who've done it but want to remain connected to global thinking,
Yeah.
or, and that's amazing, because they've then got market intel and they've got re-established networks and they get it
Yeah.
and they can support it. And people often say to me, I walk away and my shoulders have come down from my ears,
Yeah.
because I feel seen and I feel understood. And I think it's really important to have that support around you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also, to the point of shared experience, it's a piece of advice that I often give to people who are coming from overseas for the first time is, when you're sort of networking and looking to build relationships, look for people who have that shared experience, who understand what you're going through. A, they're going to have great advice for you, but B, they're so much more likely to help you because they understand what you're going through. And it
It's
makes
common
a
ground.
huge, absolutely. And also it makes that initial reach out easier, because you're not sort of trying to, I was going to say fabricate, that's not the right word, but you're not trying to come up with some sort of bridge as to why you're reaching out to this person. the bridges,
Yeah.
the shared experience. Yeah,
Yeah. And I think people and networks are generous by nature, and they
I
want to
agree.
support and they want to help. They just don't know how.
Yeah.
So making it easy for people to share and contribute
Mm,
um, is the key, you know. So if you're reaching out to a network that you don't know, but you can see in their background that they came out of a market that you've been in and they landed in a market that you want to be, simply asking them to share their
yeah,
story
absolutely.
is possibly, you know, one of the best things you can do. And they can give
Mm,
of that easily, because if they think, oh, they're asking me for a job and I don't have a job,
yeah, exactly.
but, you
Yeah.
know, I do have a story and I do
Yeah.
maybe have a network that could help them, then
Yeah.
that's different. Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I could talk to you about this topic,
Ah!
Marco, all day,
I could
but I
probably talk about
am,
it all day
yeah,
too,
I
but
know.
yeah.
But I am going to go to our final question because I'm conscious of time, and
Yeah.
it's the same final question as it always is on the podcast, and that is,
Mm.
what do you know now that you wish you knew then?
I think I would probably say that career and growth isn't always linear. You know, so when I left school or when I left uni and I first trained as a teacher, I thought I was on a path to being a teacher, you know, in the
Mm,
education system and in that
yeah,
system all the way through. And I think that when we appreciate that it's not a linear path, it gives us permission to get curious and to kind of explore other opportunities. And I don't mean be dismissive of where you've come from, but like it
mm,
doesn't have to stay in that lane. And I think I possibly would have lent into some of the transitions a little bit more easily if I thought about, well, this could be a nice segue into something else. And there's a beautiful YouTube clip. I think it's put out, I think it's HBR actually, and it talks about your career. Look at your career as a rock wall, not as a ladder. Because we've kind of grown up
yeah.
with the fact that,
We
we're used to
have,
going up a
yeah.
rung, right?
We even
But
call it that, don't we?
the
Yeah,
career ladder, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And you are either on the ladder or you've leapt off the ladder. And
yeah.
they're saying, well, actually, if you think about it as a rock wall and you're climbing the rock
Mm,
wall, sometimes it's better to step out and slightly up rather
yeah,
than straight up. It's safer. There's more
yeah.
opportunities. We're all still heading for the top, but
Mm,
or heading for the goal, but there are
mm,
different ways to get there. So I think that's something that would have been helpful if I'd left school thinking I'm going to have multiple careers. And
yeah, yeah,
but yeah, so yeah, thinking that it's not just one way to get there.
yeah,
Um, and I think then in saying that, it's okay for it not to be prescribed or figured out at every single step, because I think some of the greatest opportunities and growth have come when we've stayed anchored to our core and our values and our motivators and the problems that we like to solve, but it might be in a different form. It might be in a different
yeah.
company. It might be in a different sort of industry or lane or way of delivering
Mm,
something. So I think really thinking more broadly, not just up and down, I
yeah.
think is probably one thing. Mm,
I think that's a really, really important piece of advice. And I haven't
mm.
heard that analogy before with
Yeah,
the, that's a really good analogy. I'm,
yeah.
I'm going to go and
I'll
Google
say I'll
and
share
find
it.
that video.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you say it, the visual is immediate in your
Yeah.
mind and you can see it so clearly. That's, yeah,
Yeah.
awesome.
Who would have
Thank
thought
you.
I'd be a business owner? That was never on my
Yeah,
radar.
yeah.
So, but you're anchored to your core and what you love to do. And yeah, so,
Very cool. Thank you, Margot. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your experience and sharing so many really useful and important insights
ah,
as well. So thank you.
yeah. Thanks, Emma. I've loved our chat. And as you say, we could have chatted all day, but
I know we did
yeah,
quite well. We kept it
we've
within the
done well.
bounds.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Great. Thanks,
Thank
then.
you.